Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. I appreciate the opportunity to address the Chamber today. Like many others, I'd like to express the deep condolences of the Government of Canada, of our delegation, and many of us personally for the loss of Madeleine Albright. She was truly an outstanding public servant. She was a great leader for the United States. She was a great friend of Canada, and indeed of our foreign minister who was with her when she was Secretary of State, and we shall miss her presence on the world stage. It's a loss for all of us. This is now a defining time for the United Nations. The Russian Federation is continuing its illegal invasion of Ukraine, an unprovoked act of aggression against its neighbor. Russia has, to this point, expressed no repentance and has carried on unabated since we last met to condemn its actions as a serious violation of the United Nations Charter. In the last few days, the International Court of Justice has also ordered that Russia immediately suspend its military operation in Ukraine. And yet, Russia, a permanent member of the Security Council, a creator of the Nuremberg process, signatory to the creation of the International Court of Justice and to the Geneva Conventions, carries on as if there is no law and there are no rules above them. We know now how serious the humanitarian situation in Ukraine in fact is. Scores of innocent civilians, including children, have been killed and injured. And this situation is not getting better, it's getting worse by the hour. We are witnessing before our very eyes the premeditated destruction of entire cities. What is happening in Mariupol right now tells you everything you need to know about this particularly cruel war of aggression. Russia is laying siege to this city and to others, to its people, bombing hospitals, bombing schools, flattening entire apartment complexes. Expected mothers, children, and the medical staff at the Children's Hospital and Maternity Ward were slaughtered in a particularly gruesome attack on the 9th of March. This is part of a horrific trend. In just 25 days, the United Nations has verified 52 attacks against healthcare centers in Ukraine. Medical personnel and facilities are supposed to be protected under international humanitarian law. These attacks and all attacks against civilians and against civilian areas must stop. There is no justification for these attacks, and there's nothing special about Russia's military operation in Ukraine. It is directed at whole cities, at people's homes. But we also have to remember that, as with any armed conflict, it immediately gives rise to obligations for all parties under international humanitarian law. These laws are designed to protect civilians, to limit suffering, and ensure that those in need of aid receive it. These obligations cannot be willed or bargained away. They apply to Russia, and they apply to Ukraine, and they must be observed. The resolution before us, the humanitarian consequences of the aggression against Ukraine, Canada has been proud to join in co-sponsoring with more than 80 countries. We affirm this by demanding full compliance with international humanitarian law and for desperately needed humanitarian access. If this resolution is passed, there will be no delay in the provision of humanitarian assistance, and there will be no division about the provision of humanitarian assistance. More than 10 million Ukrainians have been forced to flee their homes. 10 million. Think about that number for a minute. 10 million in 4 weeks. That is more people forcibly displaced by Russia's military in Ukraine than the entire population of more than 100 states that are represented in this assembly. 10 million people in 4 weeks displaced. Of those, 3 million are refugees plus have fled Ukraine since the start of this war. This is creating enormous strain on neighboring countries, and that's not an accident either. And adding unnecessarily to the already record numbers of refugees and displaced persons globally, who have fled from Afghanistan, from Venezuela, the Sahel region, Syria, Myanmar, and so many other conflicts. While we are focused today on Ukraine, we cannot neglect these and other situations. Humanitarian needs everywhere deserve just as much care and attention. Canada will continue to respond to those needs, just as we respond to the catastrophe that is unfolding in Ukraine. Mr. President, it's important to remember that the impacts of this war of aggression by Russia on Ukraine are, of course, devastating Ukraine. That's what they're intended to do. That's what Russia has set out to do, to destroy and undermine the economy, the structure, the people, the cities, and the humanity of Ukraine. But they're also felt outside the region, as many people have said, in the least developed countries and by vulnerable populations around the world. Rising energy prices, supply chain disruptions, impacts on food security, food shortages leading to higher prices, to hardships, to instability, to malnutrition, to starvation, and yes, to famine. These impacts of Russia's war of choice, and that's what it is. This is a war that has created all of these impacts and had all of these effects. They threaten such hard-won progress on development that we've made over the last decade, distract the world from its recovery from the COVID impact, and undermine efforts to combat climate change and to achieve the SDGs. Mais, Monsieur le Président, soyons clairs. Tous ces impacts et ces crises, aussi graves soient-ils, peuvent diminuer demain si la Russie met fin à sa guerre d'agression. La Russie doit mettre fin à cette guerre avant que d'autres dommages ne soient causés. L'Assemblée générale, dans sa première résolution de cette session extraordinaire d'urgence, a déploré les actions de la Russie comme une violation de la Charte des Nations unies, de ses objectifs et de ses principes. La guerre de la Russie n'est pas seulement contre l'Ukraine, et il faut se souvenir de ça. L'Ukraine n'est pas la seule victime de cette guerre. Elle va à l'encontre des principes et des engagements que nous avons pris collectivement en signant la Charte des Nations unies. C'est une guerre alors contre la paix, contre le progrès, contre la liberté des nations et les peuples de choisir leur propre destin. Nous sommes les Nations unies et nous ne sommes pas les empires en guerre. Monsieur le Président, chers collègues, c'est une guerre que le président Poutine ne peut pas remporter. Et là, il faut mettre de dire encore, il ne peut pas remporter. La Russie a empêché le Conseil de sécurité de s'acquitter de son devoir fondamental de protéger la paix et la sécurité du monde. Elle a également empêché le Conseil, par la menace d'un veto, d'adopter une résolution humanitaire. Alors, maintenant, il incombe à nouveau, encore une fois, à l'Assemblée générale de défendre l'ordre international fondé sur les règles au sein duquel l'ONU et sa charte jouent un rôle central. Nous avons devant nous aujourd'hui une résolution qui, selon nous, devrait mériter le soutien de tous les pays. Le Canada vous exhorte de l'appuyer. Nous avons écouté très attentivement dans cette Assemblée et au cours de nos conversations les préoccupations exprimées par tous les États membres. We were asked to address concerns about impacts on the least developed countries, about the discrimination against any refugee fleeing Ukraine, about the safety of foreign students, about food security, and the need to fully fund the UN's Global Humanitarian Response Plan. The resolution that has been tabled does just that, in addition to demanding the protection of civilians and safe and unhindered humanitarian access. There's been a suggestion, and we've heard it again today, that a humanitarian resolution should not say anything about the cause of the crisis or ascribe responsibility to any party. With great respect, Mr. President, we disagree. This is not a natural disaster. A humanitarian crisis of this type is not a spontaneous event. It didn't just happen. It happened because one country attacked deliberately, without provocation, another country. It is the direct result of a deliberate decision by the Russian Federation to invade Ukraine. To put it in simplest terms, we cannot talk about Moby Dick without mentioning that it's a whale. We can't do it. We can't pretend it didn't happen. We can't just set it aside and say that's of no importance. If we do not identify the aggressor and do not insist that it uphold its obligation to fully respect international law and comply with the legally binding order of the International Court of Justice, then I would argue we have failed to do our job. A ceasefire and a withdrawal of occupying troops is necessary to take the next steps. Le fondateur suisse de la Croix-Rouge internationale, Henri Dunant, fut si touché par la dévastation humaine sur le champ de bataille à Solferino qu'il a commencé son travail exemplaire menant aux principes fondateurs de l'aide humanitaire et aux obligations de tous en temps de guerre. On dit que ses dernières paroles avant sa mort ont été la question « Où est l'humanité ?» Nous devons aujourd'hui répondre. Nous sommes ici. We are going to be voting yes today on this resolution for this reason, for humanity. We vote yes for humanity, not in the name of being able to solve all the problems of the world, because we cannot do that, but rather because we have to take the footsteps to peace, truth, justice, and reconciliation. And yes, sometimes we have to say difficult things, and we cannot avoid the facts and the reality of this situation. The Canadian poet Leonard Cohen put it this way: there are no perfect offerings. There's a crack. There's a crack in everything. But that's where the light gets in. Let us keep our eyes on the light, and let us face the time ahead in love and solidarity with one another. Despite our differences, we will get there. But we do it with honesty and with courage and with solidarity. Thank you, Mr. President.